This is based in part again on Pat Laughlin's work on demonstrability. The idea that the reason that groups can have a truth wins type process is because they share a certain background knowledge or set of axioms about how this problem is supposed to work. And even if they couldn't use them to come up with the right answer, they can realize when someone else uses them that this is the right way to go. So that's how truth wins out. And what I'm going to argue is this is sort of how these shared cognitions work, but the shared cognitions don't always have to be right. They can sometimes be wrong. And in those situations, you'll actually get the group performing less well than individuals for those types of tasks. And so we're going to look at 3 different task domains that I've looked at. And the first one is going to be the use of base rate information in estimating probabilities. There's a common finding in a lot of these types of problems that individuals underutilize base rate. Second thing we're going to look at is in syllogistic reasoning, and the third one will be estimating time-joint probabilities. So the first one, in terms of base rate neglect, basically using a standard common diversity CAB type problem. What we did is we varied the witness's accuracy from, and the standard problem is a witness is a accident at night, recognizes the cab color is green, but the base rate of green cabs in the city is very low. So if you're taking into account the base rate and the fact that the witness isn't perfectly accurate, you should estimate downward. But individuals, the median response tends to be about 80% in that case. Well, when you look at what groups do, you'll see that they actually exacerbate this bias in that condition. When the witness is 80% accurate, groups were more likely to use 80%. They actually are further away from the quote-unquote Bayesian solution, which in that case is about 41%. So they're actually performing worse than individuals. But if you notice down at the lower accuracy levels, since doing a Bayesian analysis always brings it down lower than the witness's accuracy, you'll notice that the groups are actually performing better in those circumstances. Same exact problem type, just different assumptions underlying what's going on. And I think what happens is at the individual level, these are just, we asked individuals after they've been in the groups, how did your group make the decision? Did you just go with the witness's accuracy? Did you just go with the base rate, or did you combine the two? And we're just looking at here at the response rates for only went with the source, the witness, or only went with the base rate. A large number of people said they used both, regardless of whether they actually did. But if you just look at this, in the 80% case, about 45% of the individuals were going with just the source, but about 55% of the groups were going that way. So it was exacerbating this use of the witness's accuracy. And in that case, well, the witness is 80% likely, they don't know how to do Bayesian problems. That seems very plausible. But as soon as you get to 50% accuracy, this no longer seems plausible. Now, individuals didn't really vary all that much in their statements of whether or not they used base rates or witnesses' accuracy, but groups did. By the time it got down to 20%, a very coherent argument is, this person's doing worse than chance. And so they just ignore the witness at that point, and they go with the base rate information. So again, depending on which of these two sort of shared cognitions came into play, would affect whether or not the groups did better than the average individual or worse than the average individual. Okay, syllogistic reasoning problem. I won't go into a lot of detail. These studies were generated to do something very, very different. But we sort of stumbled upon this, and this was some original work done in conjunction with Tatsuya. We were looking at syllogistic reasoning problems and having individuals and groups work on them. And generally speaking, groups did better than individuals, and the Japanese kicked the butts of the American students. But except for one problem. There was one problem where the results actually went the other way. Groups did worse, considerably worse than individuals. And it was extremely pronounced much more in the Japanese sample than in the American sample. So we went looking for what was going on here, and the key thing seemed to be the problem used a sum XRY premise. And from a logic point of view, some R could include all R. But from a conversational norm perspective, you would not qualify it with some if you didn't intend to mean that some are not. And so what happened is, in that particular problem, they misinterpreted how you're supposed to look at this from a very plausible position, and they actually got worse. So we actually went in and designed a study to look at this. We got 8 syllogisms together. All of them used some in the premises, but in half of the conditions, the problem was valid. Usually, if you assume some are implies some are not, it will lead you to a valid conclusion. It'll sort of lean you towards saying valid. So half of the cases, this would lead them to valid. Half of the cases, they might be biased toward valid, but in fact it would be, the correct solution would be the other direction. And what we find is when you compare individuals and groups, for the valid ones, the groups did better than the individuals. But for the invalid ones, they actually did worse than the individuals. And if you look at the social decision scheme matrices for these, again, for the valid ones, you'll see that there's sort of a bias toward the correct answer. Even a minority of 2 members favoring the correct answer could pull people in that direction. What you see here is exactly the opposite type of trend going on for the invalid cases. That a minority saying valid was more powerful than a majority saying not valid. Okay, so again, same problem, exact same conditions. The only thing that changes is whether or not a plausible assumption helps you go to the right answer, or helps you not go to the right answer. And we looked at this in terms of whether or not the group discussions mentioned this particular issue, because some groups don't discuss much of anything. They just say, "What is it? This? Okay," and they go. But some groups actually talk about it a little bit, and we found out that for the valid ones, they mentioned the some are not, and they almost always resolve that statement as saying, "Well, it must mean some are not valid." They never resolve it correctly, or at least very rarely. But in the valid cases, it actually helped their performance if they brought it up. For the invalid cases, it actually hurt their performance. Okay. Final set of problems I want to talk about today are the conjunction errors. This is again a common Tversky problem, standard Linda the bank teller issue, where you give a brief personality sketch of the person, and it sort of implies that they would be one type of person rather than another. In the Linda the bank teller case, the brief personality sketch makes her seem lively and active and sort of liberal, and then you're asked, what's the likelihood that she's a bank teller? And people go, no, it's not very likely. And what's the likelihood that she's a feminist? And everyone goes, yeah, it sounds fits. And then you ask them, what's the likelihood that she is both a bank teller and a feminist? Well, that can't be any higher than bank teller, but almost, I can't say no one, some people actually figure this out, but very few of them do. Most people go, oh, somewhere in the middle. And so this is a fairly common error. But you can also look at different types of conjunctions, and what you find is that for 2 likely events, or 1 likely and 1 unlikely event, conjunction errors are quite frequent. But for 2 unlikely events, they're fairly rare. People actually tend to see if there's 2 very not likely events being conjoined, you tend to rate them even lower. And so what we find is when you compare individual group performance on these things, you see that for the likely and the likely-unlikely pairs, these are error rates, by the way, groups actually make more errors than individuals. But in the one case where they're looking at 2 unlikely pairs, they actually perform somewhat better. Okay? And again, you look at the social decision scheme matrices for these situations. This is the case where they're looking at 2 unlikely situations. And again, you see there's a bit of a bias toward the correct answer coming out during the group discussion. Even a single person not making the error will tend to pull the group to some degree in that direction, but in an even split, they're more likely to go with the correct person under the circumstances. You see in this situation, the reverse is true. You also notice that there's a whole lot of uncertainty in these data. Even with all 4 members not making the error, the group can actually reach consensus on something that is actually making the error. They don't realize that they're making the error when they're doing this, but it can happen. But usually, if most of the people are not making the error, they won't. But as soon as there's one person that's making the error, it tends to pull the group estimate high enough so that it is now in the error range for the group. just a last set of studies that we looked at. One of the things we wanted to see is, would this get better if we use familiar rather than unfamiliar situations? There's some evidence that these types of errors are very likely for these sort of abstract, strange problems with Linda Bank television. Know anything about Linda? What if we ask them about the typical Loyola student? And what we find out is it does make a difference in the likely-unlikely case. They're pretty good at realizing that if you give them a highly unlikely characteristic of a Loyola student, they go with it, and they will be less likely to make the error. But it doesn't do anything to the likely case, because then they just do the same thing. If there's two likely events, it's actually higher. And that's basically what we find here for the likely-unlikely case for the familiar item. People were relatively unlikely to make the errors, and groups showed better performance. Again, down here is better because there's fewer errors. But in the likely case, they actually made more errors on these certain things. And again, you can look at this for the LU case. We see, again, these are pretty small sample sizes, but there was a pretty strong bias toward the correct answer here, meaning that, and this was like, this is a Loyola student, a math major. Math is not a particularly popular major at Loyola, most people know this. And so as soon as you put math major in the mix, they almost said it was very, very unlikely regardless of what you paired it with. When you gave them two likely items, again, you see this sort of asymmetry flowing back toward the erroneous response. Okay? And again, looking at the process, this is just, we actually looked at how the groups made decisions and judged how they were reaching their conclusions. The two most likely things that occurred was they went with one of the members' initial estimate suggestions. Someone said, well, I said 70%. And they go, oh yeah, that's good. Or someone will say, I said 70. I said 60. And they'll merge and go to 65. So those were the two most common things. And under the familiar case, groups actually increased performance relative to individuals when they use that particular alternative. But or in the likely-unlikely case, for the familiar code, that actually helped groups under those circumstances. They would get better. Using that process in the unfamiliar case did not do better. It reverses when you look at the likely case. Using one of those two strategies actually increased their error rate relative to individuals. Okay? So conclusions. Yes, I'm not saying that good group processes can't lead to better performance and that bad group processes can't lead to bad performance. Obviously, those things can happen. And if you train groups how to use all of their information and things like that, that can usually be a good thing. But I think in most circumstances, most groups don't really do either of those things. They tend to look at what the preference structure is in the group, they discuss, and they sort of reach the things that they sort of share in terms of what's important for this task, and they use that to reach a conclusion. I would say in most circumstances, that's probably not a half bad thing to do, because in most cases, people are somewhat familiar with the things they're making decisions about, and usually that will actually make groups be better than individuals, but we as psychologists can come up with situations where it won't, and there are some relatively important situations where key assumptions are just wrong, and if the group shares that assumption will guide them in a wrong direction. And it's not because they had an overbearing leader or they had feelings that we can't be wrong, or it's just that they did what groups do. And in that situation, what groups did didn't help them very much. Thank you. Unfortunately, we really did not need a whole lot of questions, and since lunch is the next thing on the menu here, but thank you all for coming, and see you get a chance to talk to the